These days, people love making comparisons between brands about which is better than the other. There are elaborate tier lists and an endless amount of videos trying to convince you that X brand is better than Y brand. Well, here's another. Just kidding. But today's watch does come from a brand that is considered to be above Grand Seiko these days. But is it? Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we'll be looking at a watch, like I said, from a brand considered to be above Grand Seiko. However, that brand is still from within the Seiko Epson group, and it's Creedor. If you look at their pricing, you could argue that they definitely sit above Grand Seiko. However, they weren't always so expensive, and in some cases, still aren't today if you know what to look for. This is the Creedor Pacifique Kinetic. Yep, I didn't think I'd get one either, but if you look at the back catalogue of their quartz and even mechanical in some cases, these Pacifique watches can be found for a very reasonable price. For quartz and kinetic like this one, they can be found quite easily for under $1,000. But what do you get for your money besides the name on the dial that until very recently, very few people would have even recognized at all? To be honest, you get quite a bit. You get a very attractive looking watch that fits with the current trend of integrated bracelet watches, a striking and unique design, a solid well-made watch, and, even, for the first time on the channel, some precious metal. You see, that bezel glinting in the light is actually 18 karat white gold. In recent times, watches have changed quite a bit. They have become a lot more solid, substantial, and overbuilt. Even Rolex was using pressed clasps and folded links not that long ago. So, while I don't think it's fair to try and compare this watch with modern Grand Seiko, it definitely is capable of standing on its own 2 feet in today's market environment. Because it will be a bit of an elephant in the room if I don't, let's talk about the sizing first up. It's small by today's standards, but you'll have to decide whether it's too small. The way that the case sides flare out definitely help it to wear a bit bigger, as does the fact that it's an integrated bracelet rather than a traditional one. That said, measuring from crown guard across the largest section of the case is just a bit over 36mm, which can be okay. After all, my Tudor was 36 and I felt it wore fine. What makes this different is the dial size. It's got the dial of a watch more like a 34mm than a 36mm watch. There isn't really a lug width here, but the size of the bracelet when it leaves the case measures 20mm, which I think also helps to have more presence on wrist. Thickness is very comfortable at 9.6mm, which makes sense, since it's essentially a quartz watch. Lug to lug is a bit hard to measure because of the bracelet and how it kind of flares out from the case. If we measure to the lugs themselves, it's 38mm, but by the time the bracelet actually curves down, we are well into the mid-40s. Since we've done that already, let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. Sure, it's a bit small and a little bit undersized, but honestly I don't actually mind it. The style of this watch is quite elegant, especially with the gold on the bezel, so a smaller kind of size suits it. It also feels quite thin to wear with the kinetic movement, and that matches the smaller size. As I turn my wrist, you can see the bezel and details around the case playing with the light really well. The bracelet is also quite intricate, with a lot of visual detail going on there too. I wouldn't say that it would suit as an everyday watch with this size, but for a special occasion I think it's perfect. Part of what helps it to wear so well, I think, is the 20mm bracelet size to beef it up. Okay, by now you should have decided whether the size is okay or too small. So, if you're still here, let's take a closer look at the watch. What better place to start than the dial? It actually reminds me a bit of the Pagani design chronograph we looked at in a previous video, with the main white dial and grey contrasting ring. No off-white or slightly cream colour here. This dial is a crisp white, with equally crisp printing. Above the pinion is Creedor in a slightly larger size than the word Seiko. This watch has dual branding because it was made in a time when Creedor and Grand Seiko brands were still under Seiko. Beneath the pinion is the word Kinetic. The funny thing to note is that all 3 lines of text on the dial are in 3 different fonts to each other. Around that is a grey, slightly metallic section that holds the hour markers. There is no lume on the watch at all, so the hour markers are simple rectangular batons. They are all applied and nicely finished with polished bevels. Instead of one of the markers at 12, we have the Creedor logo applied in its place. It's a nice little touch and works really well. The outer edge of the dial goes back to that crisp white and serves as a place for the minute track. At each 5 minutes, there is a small applied marker which catches the light occasionally. The outer white section is actually raised off the rest of the dial and creates a bit of depth if you look closely at the watch. The hands are quite simple on this watch. No loom as I mentioned and quite thin. They are sword shaped and have a bevel running down the middle. They're all high polished, which could have been a recipe for disaster in terms of legibility. But thankfully against that white backdrop, they're always legible no matter the lighting conditions. That legibility is aided by a nice piece of crystal. I couldn't find whether it's mineral or sapphire, but I suspect it's sapphire based on how it looks and feels. It's slightly domed, and I'd also suggest that there's some kind of anti-reflective coating on it, because it's pretty clear even under bright lights. Now we come back to the case. It's got some vague similarities to the Patek Nautilus with those case sides, but has a strong identity of its own. I certainly wouldn't call it anything near a homage. The bezel is also quite interesting, almost a combination of a polished and fluted bezel with those two separate sections on it. The result is a bezel that really plays with the light, and the fact that it is white gold means that it appears even more brilliant and shiny. Like the bezel, the rest of the case is all high polished until it gets to the bracelet. The way that the watch is finished here, you'd be forgiven for thinking it has regular lugs. Those brushed sections give the appearance of lugs, but it's all one piece. The bracelet itself is much like the bezel in the way it catches the light with lots of different surfaces. Each of those polished and brushed sections you see are actually individual pieces in the link, so all up there are 9 pieces. One sign that a watch is quality is the bracelet links actually being made from separate pieces rather than simply being finished to look like it. The links are small, so the bracelet conforms to the wrist really well and tapers from that 20mm at the case to 17 at the clasp. Now, the clasp on this watch is actually pretty interesting. It proves that it is possible to have a solid, milled clasp mechanism while maintaining a very low profile and thinness. It's even actually thinner than pressed clasps too, and possibly the thinnest clasp I've personally had experience with. It's really comfortable in operation and doesn't even feel like it's there. It also has the interesting feature of having a cutout in the outer shell to reveal part of the scissor mechanism inside. That section we can see happens to be the section that Creedor have branded, and I think it's a really cool way to keep the clasp looking like it's signed, without it actually being so. It's just a press fit clasp, but feels solid and has never made me concerned about it coming apart. There is one major aspect of the watch I haven't talked about yet, and that's the movement. This watch is my first experience with the kinetic movement. I won't claim to understand it completely, but essentially it uses a rotor type weight in the movement that spins, and the movement of your arm creates a charge for the battery powering the quartz movement inside the watch. That means it still requires movement to get working, but also still has the quartz ticking secondhand, unlike spring drive which works in a different way. Some people seem to not really like this type of movement, but I'm not fussed either way. As long as it works and is reliable, I'm not worried. One thing to note though is that since this watch is quite old, kinetic movements have improved quite a lot since it was made. These days, movements can have power reserves of months at a time, but this one has a maximum power reserve of only 3 days. So, is it better than a Grand Seiko? Well, no. Not the ones I have at least, but it is a fantastic little watch that looks like nothing else I have, and still maintains a high level of quality and finishing for a very reasonable price. What do you think about this watch? Have you seen these older Creedor models before? Do you care at all about the Creedor name, or is it just another Seiko? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.